Good morning. Thank you so much for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and in preparation for our study of 1st and 2nd Peter, I want to take just a little bit of time to talk about Peter from the book of Acts and what we know about Peter from the book of Acts and also from Paul's writings as well. Paul tells us that Peter was married and that he often traveled with his wife when he went on missionary journeys. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. That's a pretty cool detail. Paul and Peter loom over the book of Acts, not like the Holy Spirit does. Of course, the Holy Spirit is the main character in the book of Acts, and the main topic of the book of Acts is the good news about Jesus. But the person who is there in every event, moving the events, is the Holy Spirit. But as Luke wrote the book of Acts, clearly as a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. And we're not exactly sure what purpose. It might just be to finish the story. But anyway, as Luke tells us in his Gospel, he's crafting a biography. And in a very real sense, the book of Acts is crafted as a biography of the first century church, or maybe the church in the first 30 years of its existence, and through basically two characters, and one is through the ministry of Peter, and the second is through the ministry of Paul, and they kind of have parallel lives in the book of Acts. And for instance, they both get sprung from jail miraculously. Peter on more than one occasion, but Peter by himself that one time. And those two stories really parallel in some ways, and that is probably my favorite story in the book of Acts, is Peter being sprung from prison whenever he was waiting to die for Jesus. They both raised the dead once. Peter raises Tabitha from the dead in Joppa, and then Paul raises Eutychus from the dead. Both of them also, start out with their partner, Peter and John, Paul and Barnabas. Both of them heal in unusual ways. We're told in Acts chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, that Peter was able to heal his shadow. People were just wanting to be in his shadow as he passed by, and they would be healed. And then in Acts chapter 19, verses 11 and 12, we're told that people who couldn't get close to Paul, they would send handkerchiefs and aprons, and if he touched them, then they would be healed. And those are both really cool details. Little moments, just very small moments in the book of Acts, but connect Peter and Paul's ministries. And of course, we know from Paul's writings that there was at times tension between the two men. Paul never calls Peter Peter, really. He calls him Simon, or Cephas. I don't know why that's the case, but he does. He seems to prefer that name to those two names to Peter. And then we have the episode from the book of Galatians about what happened at Antioch when Peter came to Antioch, and this evidently happened early on, and it's a disturbing event where Peter is showing favoritism to Jewish Christians and not eating at table fellowship with Gentile Christians, which is interesting because Jesus himself said, "What I have, made clean, don't call it common and unclean," because Peter himself preached the gospel to Cornelius, the first Gentile convert, and sat at table with these Gentiles and then had to defend that in Acts chapters 10 and 11 to the people back in Jerusalem, who were not upset that he'd baptized a Gentile. They were upset that he sat at table with them. What I think we see from Peter in the book of Acts, we're not going to rehash events. We know early on, there in Jerusalem, he and John were performing miracles, preaching the gospel, went to jail after Stephen is executed. the people who stayed in Jerusalem fled. Before that happened, of course, we have the Ananias and Sapphira episode. Peter's the one who's the spokesperson there. Um, um, people spread out and take the gospel to the world as Jesus had intended. For a while, the apostles stay there in Jerusalem. We have what happens at Antioch with Barnabas and Paul. We have the Jerusalem conference in Acts 15, which deals with Gentile converts, and at that conference, Peter is not the spokesperson. He speaks and defends Paul and Barnabas and says, this is the work of God. We cannot in any way not accept this, and speaks up as Paul's advocate. But James, the brother of Jesus, is the one who closes out the meeting with the final word. So that's interesting too. I think all of it's interesting. But what's interesting to me is the evolution of him. We already see a completely different person from the end of John and the beginning of the book of Acts. At the beginning of John, at the end of John's gospel, Peter's kind of still bouncing around. I mean, he's so emotionally intense at times, and we see that, when he has to tell Jesus he loves him 3 times, and that whole story, and it's just so, you feel so awkward for Peter that Jesus is doing this. But then right after the ascension, they're waiting in Jerusalem for the coming of the Holy Spirit. They choose someone to replace Judas. Peter's the one who's the spokesperson. Let's do this. Peter is the one whose voice we hear on the day of Pentecost. Peter is the one who is so, he appears before the high priest. He has only weeks before, in this very spot, denied Jesus because he was afraid. And he says the first time, you choose whether we should obey God or you. And the second time says, we are going to obey God, not you. So there's this confidence. And then by the time, which is the last episode we read about him, except for the Jerusalem conference, by the time he is busted out of jail, when Herod is wanting to kill him, and he knows he's going to die the next day, he's sleeping, chained up to the watchman, one on either side, and he's asleep and has to be woken up. There's just this calm about him, and it's not a straight line. I mean, he preached on the day of Pentecost that the gospel was for everybody, but then Jesus had to appear to him multiple times on the roof of Simon the tanner's house to get him to get with the program and go preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And then after that event happened, we have the whole issue, at Antioch with Peter and Paul. But so it wasn't a straight line, but there is this evolution, not only of his confidence, but of his calm, of his spirit, of his person. So we see this constant progress and change in Peter, who gains confidence and then gains calm. And that's how we really leave him in the book of Acts. So next time we're together, we're going to introduce 1st and 2nd Peter as texts, and then we'll get into the text of 1 Peter following that. Thank you for joining me.